Greetings, fellow skeptics and lovers of Western culture, in a way that's definitely not racist, to my mind palace of higher knowledge and objective reasoning, in which I talk exclusively about superhero movies, Star Wars and comic books, all the while insisting that I'm actually a connoisseur of classic literature, because I'm incredibly insecure about the fact that I'm so creatively bankrupt that all my attempts at writing fiction failed spectacularly, and I can't be fucking bothered to actually read any classic literature. So now, rather than taking the criticisms on board and improving in any way, I'm going to give up on that dream and instead take out my frustration and bitterness over my failure by tearing down other creative people in incredibly shallow ways, mostly by failing to understand the basic fundamentals of film theory, and crying whenever I see a black person or woman in a position of power or dominance, because I'm incredibly concerned about the idea that white cis-het men are losing their position as the dominant force in media. But not like in a weird way, I just really don't want LGBTQ plus people, blacks or women, in my movies for non-racist reasons, like women are weak and should only be in movies when they're written to be exactly like men, any movie that criticizes existing power structures is made by and for SJWs because I am incapable of imagining a better way of living than the current status quo, or to stop licking this boot, and they are forcing diversity on your kids. Hey, did you know that Rey is a Mary Sue? Oh, you already do think you know that because like 500 people already made the exact same boring, misinformed video about The Last Jedi, assuming that literally anyone on the left actually has any kind of emotional attachment or investment in a mass-produced piece of art made by one of the biggest corporations on the planet? Well, I also don't understand what leftism is, so I'm going to pretend that they're as basic as I am and assume that they, like me, base a majority of their personality around fucking Star Wars. Today we're going to be talking about the fact that some feminists online are interpreting and analysing art using existing analytical frameworks in ways that I don't like, causing me to try to control their speech despite my claims to be a free speech absolutist when people criticise me for using the N-word, and demonstrating my utter lack of knowledge about topics I claim to care about and base my entire career around by getting unreasonably angry about someone pointing out that a movie I liked is potentially racist. I mean, come on, what's racist about Temple of Doom, for fuck's sake?
Dessert. Chilled monkey brain.
Is it water with the sheep in the box?
I haven't mentioned it at all yet during this series, which is unsurprising because this is only the second episode, but I actually have a degree in screenwriting, so unlike when I talk about history, philosophy, politics or music, topics about which I have become interested in and read up on extensively since leaving university, film theory is probably the one thing I'm actually qualified to talk about. In hindsight, yes, it probably was a massive waste of time and money, but thanks to the fact that a screenwriting degree is unlikely to help me get a good job anyway, the likelihood of me ever having to pay it back is extremely low. Haha, screw you, the government. I'll never pay you back, and all I have to do is be poor for the rest of my life. Oh wait, shit, that's not worth it at all. Point is, when a lot of these people will talk authoritatively about what they teach in screenwriting classes, first of all, they're missing the point, because a lot of the time film school is about preparing people to enter the industry and make them able to neatly slot into the existing Hollywood structure, not to be better artists or whatever. I didn't even learn about the various different kinds of story structure we went over in the last episode until my third year, when we started studying theatre and the history of storytelling, because the first 2 years of my screenwriting education were spent hammering home that the best ways to structure a story are the 3-act structure, Sid Field, the hero's journey, save the cat, all that shit. And you know what? Everyone in my class loved that module because it felt like we actually had freedom after years of being very deliberately restricted in what we were told was acceptable to write. Screenwriting classes do not exist to prepare students to create transcendent works of art. They exist to prepare students to enter the mainstream film industry with an overview of how stories and screenwriting currently predominantly are, in order to maximize their chances of getting work by slotting nicely into existing roles and templates. I can't tell you how many times I've had work handed back to me and marked down because it wasn't marketable enough, for example. Something that often goes misunderstood by the sort of people who get so mad that they make 12-hour streams about someone who disagrees with them about a superhero movie they like is the idea of objective critique. Now, I'm not really going to discuss the concept of objectivity objectivity and any depth here, because Patricia Taxon already did that better than I could. But in order to proceed with today's lesson, we will necessarily have to accept the premise that a work of art cannot be objectively good or bad, or objectively critiqued without a subjective framework of analysis. If that's your belief, then fine, but you won't get much out of this video because you will reject its premise, though whilst you're here, I'd appreciate if you could just leave the checklist of how to make an objectively good work of art, which definitely has to exist, because in order for a work to be objectively critiqued, there must be an unchanging set of parameters of how to do so, and therefore theoretical platonic ideal of a movie that meets all of the points on said list must also exist. In the comments, so I can make sure to follow it and therefore never make bad art again. I love reducing art down to a paint-by-numbers exercise by attempting to remove all semblance of creativity whilst also complaining that all movies are the same nowadays. You do realise that trying to hone in on something approximating this is what led Hollywood movies to be so similar, right? It's because they tried to find a formula that would most appeal to most people, and therefore rake in a ton of money. The people pushing this objectivity shite are no different than the executives who insist on making the same movie over and over and over again, because it's popular. In fact, if anything, they're worse, because at least the executives openly acknowledge that they do the shit they do for money, whereas the YouTube movie dickheads pretentiously try to convince everyone that it's out of a love of art or some shit, whereas it is, at least in part, so they can feel smug and also rake in the ad revenue with all those overly long videos because YouTube loves its watch time. So how do we analyse the themes and meanings of a work of art? Interpretation is, of course, a highly subjective thing, and varies from person to person, so in the general population, everyone will have their own framework for doing so, usually informed by personal preferences, biases, or in some cases victim complexes, like for example the cottage industry on YouTube of weird nerds who interpret every media product with a protagonist who isn't a straight white man as some kind of attack on Western civilization or some shit.
The combined might of feminism, the social justice movement, and the idea of racial diversity and equality was enough to bring up serious questions on the ethics of the video game industry. Were some games made with racist or sexist attitudes in mind? Is this even a real issue? With so many articles, videos, and opinions floating around cyberspace, join me as I seek to understand both sides and settle this battle of feminism and SJWs versus video games.
Or people like Jack Saint who will look to interpret movies in increasingly wacky ways. The only real caveat to these interpretations is that ideally they should use at least some evidence and be based on things that actually happen within the text in order to be taken seriously. Within this framework, it's entirely possible to designate Sky High a piece of fascist eugenics propaganda, because there are definitely, some might say objectively, certain elements of the text that can be pointed to and interpreted in such a way. It's through these analytical frameworks or lenses that most people can decide whether or not they enjoyed a film, and of course forms the basis for most media criticism. After all a critic is someone paid to tell you their opinion of a work of art. They're not in any way inherently more or less correct in their opinion than the average person. Maybe they have a bit more knowledge of cinema or have some kind of education on the subject, but that doesn't make their opinion really carry any more weight. It just means that they potentially have a couple of slightly different biases that they bring to their analysis of a movie than someone you might ask on the street at random, for example. I like watching video essays interpreting and discussing media in various ways as much as the next person, but I don't necessarily think that when I see a compelling argument from Jack Saint claiming that a kid's superhero comedy movie is actually eugenics propaganda, that it's inherently correct, and to my knowledge neither does he. This is why it pisses me off when people, usually on the right, claim to know the one true interpretation of a work of art. Mauler does this a lot, claiming that he makes purely objective critiques, calling his interpretive framework the robot because it apparently exclusively focuses on things that happen within the film and then makes a subjective judgment on whether these things make a film good or bad. You know, like an algorithm doesn't, and literally every other critic on the planet does. Academia formalizes this process to a degree by designating a few of these lenses recognition and a lot of study. To illustrate what I mean here, allow me to briefly go over a few of the most commonly used academic analytical lenses. The moral lens was the earliest critical lens to come about, beginning in Book X of Plato's Republic around 360 BC. In it, he notes, "Will anyone be profited if under the influence of poetry man neglects justice and virtue?" This lens was common through the end of the 19th century. For example, in Jonathan Swift's Gulliver's Travels, Gulliver notes in one of his letters that he had written for people's amendment and not their approbation, reflecting the belief at the time that the novel was primarily a method for instruction of the populace and entertainment was only a secondary goal. This is especially true in books for for children from the time. See, for example, the book that a young Jane Eyre is given by Mr. Brocklehurst, which is a book entitled The Child's Guide. Read it with prayer, especially that part containing an account of the awfully sudden death of Martha G., a naughty child addicted to falsehood and deceit. It is meant to instruct Jane in the consequences of lying, and was common in children's literature at the time. This lens is common in the analysis of religious works, media aimed at children, and, of course, is highly interpretive due to the fact that what can be considered moral varies widely from culture to culture and even person to person. The Marxist critical lens came into vogue with the advent of, predictably, the Marxist school of thought. Sometimes also called the socio-economic lens, the Marxist lens focuses on how characters' wealth and social connections affect the work. Leon Trotsky's Literature and Revolution claims that all literature and culture were the expressions of the nobleman and the bureaucrat, and that the proletariat has also to create its own culture and its own art. This viewpoint is common for the Marxist critical lens. In theory, it's the one of these that involves applying 200-year-old books of philosophy written by men with large beards to modern movies, but most of the time it's just the practice of applying class analysis to a work of art. Also called the Freudian or Jungian critical lens, this school of thought analyzes the psychological motives of the characters. Jungian literary criticism in particular focuses on archetypes. The object of psychoanalytic literary criticism at its very simplest can be the psychoanalysis of the author or of a particularly interesting character in a given work. The criticism is similar to psychoanalysis itself, closely following the analytic interpretive process discussed in Freud's The Interpretation of Dreams and other works. Critics may view the fictional characters as psychological case studies, attempting to identify such Freudian concepts as the Oedipus complex, Freudian slips, id, ego and superego and so on, and demonstrate how they influence the thoughts and behaviours of fictional characters. Feminist literary criticism is literary criticism informed by feminist theory, or more broadly, by the politics of feminism. It uses the principles and ideology of feminism to critique the language of literature. This school of thought seeks to analyse and describe the ways in which literature portrays the narrative of male domination and other feminist issues by exploring the economic, social, political and psychological forces embedded within works of literature. Specific goals of feminist criticism include both the development and discovery of female tradition of writing and rediscovering of old texts, whilst also interpreting symbolism of women's writing so that it will not be lost or ignored by the male point of view, and resisting sexism inherent in the majority of mainstream literature. These goals, along with the intent to analyse women writers and their writings from a female perspective and increase awareness of sexual politics of language and style, were developed by Lisa Tuttle in the 1980s and have since been adopted by a majority of feminist critics. Queer theory is a field of critical theory that emerged in the early 1990s. Queer theory includes both queer readings of texts and the theorization of queerness itself. Queer theory builds both upon feminist challenges to the idea that gender is part of the essential self, and upon gay and lesbian studies' close examination of the socially constructed nature of sexual acts and identities. Whereas gay and lesbian studies focused its inquiries into homosexual behaviour, queer theory expands its focus to encompass any kind of sexual activity or identity that falls into normative and deviant categories. Through the context of heterosexuality being the origin and foundation of society's heteronormative stability, the concept of queerness in media often focuses on mismatches between sex, gender and desire. Queerness has been associated most prominently with LGBTQ+ subjects, but its analytic framework also includes such topics as cross-dressing, intersex bodies and identities, gender ambiguity and gender confirmation surgery. Queer theory holds that individual sexuality is a fluid, fragmented and dynamic collectivity of possible sexualities, and it may vary at different points during one's life. Its criticism of stable and correlated sexes, genders and sexualities develops out of the specifically lesbian and gay reworking of the post-structuralist figuring of identity as a constellation of multiple and unstable positions. Queer theory also examines the discourse of sexuality developed in the last century in order to place the queer into historical context, deconstructing contemporary arguments both for and against this latest terminology. Postcolonialism is a broad cultural approach to the study of power relations between different groups, cultures or people, in which language, literature and translation play a role. Postcolonial literature is the literature by people from formerly colonized countries, often addressing the problems and consequences of the colonization or decolonization of a country, especially questions relating to the political and cultural independence of formerly subjugated people, and themes such as racialism and colonialism. Postcolonial critical theory addresses the role of literature in perpetuating and challenging what postcolonial post-colonial critics refer to as cultural imperialism. Reader response theory focuses on the reader, or audience, and their experience of a literary work, in contrast to other schools and theories that focus attention primarily on the author or the content and form of the work. You probably know reader response theory from Roland Barthes' famous essay The Death of the Author, especially if you're a pretentious YouTube critic, because it's just the right balance of easy to understand, widely known about, but esoteric enough for you to come off looking like you're more knowledgeable than you actually are. So when you see someone saying shit like this,
I loved this movie. I loved it. Now, I wasn't gonna go on any type of rant. I was just gonna make you say, hey, I was just gonna make my point and say there was no SJW nonsense. But when I'm doing my research for this movie, look at this beauty that I run across. Because of course, these crazy SJWs have to pick it apart. We're talking about a fantastic movie from James Mangold. We're talking about fantastic performances from Matt Damon and Christian Bale. We're talking about a great movie from beginning to end, and these miserable, lifelong victims have to find something. They have to invent something to be offended over. The way Ford versus Ferrari undermines its main female character is frustratingly predictable. This is a trap that so many movies that revolve around adventure-seeking men with big dreams have fallen into. I'm not gonna read this. I just wanted to make a point to show how stupid these people are.
you know that they don't actually know what they're fucking talking about and fundamentally do not understand the purpose or existence of critical lenses or the basics of critical theory, specifically in this case feminist theory, but then again these are the same people saying that art is not subjective, so you already knew that. If you want to know about any of these in more detail, I would recommend you look into Lindsay Ellis's great series The Whole Plate, which analyses the Transformers movies using a few of these frameworks to show how different analytical lenses can draw out different and sometimes conflicting interpretations. I've definitely not really gone into much detail here because she does such a great job of it that I don't see the point in really stretching this video out to rehash the same points she makes in that series, plus I do want to keep these videos relatively short and give more of an overview than a deep dive into each topic, because I want to be able to send these to chuds who don't get basic concepts to do with movies, and no one's going to watch a feature-length academic dissertation on the intricacies of the death of the author or whatever, which I considered making, but honestly is probably the most covered topic on film YouTube, so I didn't really see the point. Now, depending on your point of view, you may consider some of these to be bullshit, and I may agree that some of them are a bit arbitrary, but I would contend that they are no more or less valid than the more commonly used unofficial lenses used by nerds on the internet, like the status quo anti-SJW lens and the Canon fan theory lens. Sure, I like using the more academic ones because they have a lot of recognition, peer reviews, fields of study, and some of them are just really interesting to think about and consider, but if you're the sort of wanker who thinks that there are too many women in media, for example, then feel free to create your own anti-feminist lens. I'm gonna laugh at you, but I'm not gonna stop you if you really want to embarrass yourself several times a day on YouTube for money. It's what you're doing already, so why not, right? Probably the best way to illustrate a concept like this is to use an example, so let's do that. Let's take an example that has been making the rounds online recently, shall we, and apply queer or gender theory to the 1999 classic, The Matrix. The Matrix is a metaphor for gender transition. I hope you're ready because this might be long, but it requires 3 pieces of information to understand. 1. The Wachowskis are both trans women who, during the time the movie was made, were in the closet. 2. Estrogen pills are red. 3. Prozac, the antidepressant often given to trans people suffering dysphoria rather than allowing them to transition, is blue, or commonly was in the past. Nowadays it's more of a capsule. The Wachowskis, 2 closeted trans women, were trying to make a point that taking the red pill would lead to freedom and happiness, but a harder life, whereas the blue pill leads to an unhappy existence, just accepting the paradigm pushed on you by the powers that be. And the Matrix itself, and by extension the agents, are a metaphor for cis heteronormativity and a society that rejects and doesn't understand trans people, in many ways trying to force them to conform to cis-het society.
As you can see, we've had our eye on you for some time now, Mr. Anderson. It seems that you've been living 2 lives. One of these lives has a future, and one of them does not.
I mean, just watch the monologue with that in mind.
I can see it in your eyes. You have the look of a man who accepts what he sees because he is expecting to wake up. Ironically, this is not far from the truth. Let me tell you why you're here. You're here because you know something. What you know you can't explain, but you feel it. You felt it your entire life, that there's something wrong with the world. You don't know what it is, but it's there, like a splinter in your mind, driving you mad. It is this feeling that has brought you to me.
The Matrix.
Do you want to know what it is? The Matrix is everywhere. It is all around us. Even now, in this very room. You can see it when you look out your window or when you turn on your television. You can feel it when you go to work, when you go to church, when you pay your taxes. It is the world that has been pulled over your eyes to blind you from the truth. You are a slave, Neo. Like everyone else, you were born into bondage, born into a prison that you cannot smell or taste or touch. A prison for your mind. Unfortunately, no one can be told what the Matrix is. You have to see it for yourself. This is your last chance. After this, there is no turning back. You take the blue pill, the story ends. You wake up in your bed and believe whatever you want to believe. You take the red pill, you stay in Wonderland, and I show you how deep the rabbit hole goes. Remember, all I'm offering is the truth.
Not to mention that at the climax, when Neo finally starts to accept himself and his fate, the fight with Agent Smith, a representative of the oppressive status quo trying to force him back into his life before he took the red pill, only turns in Neo's favour when, after the entire movie of being referred to by his previous, now rejected dead name,
Mr. Anderson.
he embraces his new identity and says, "My name is Neo," before starting to win.
I'm gonna enjoy watching you die, Mr. Anderson. Hear that, Mr. Anderson? That is the sound of inevitability. It is the sound of your death. Goodbye, Mr. Anderson. My name is Neo.
Oh, and also, one of the characters, who was literally called Switch, was originally supposed to switch between presenting male and female, but the studio vetoed it, because of course. The Matrix is a piece of trans art, and the right-wingers who have adopted the red pill in order to hate women don't seem to understand that the real red pill is to become women.
Yeah, you know what it is. Black and yellow, black and yellow, black and yellow, black and yellow. Yeah.
If any Reactionaries or right-wing Star Wars or Matrix fans are watching this, I would invite you to think over what I've talked about today and consider that a lot of what is often portrayed as crazy SJWs calling everything racist is actually people applying well-established critical lenses and decades of critical theory to a work of art. See, and this is something that primarily happens with video games nowadays, but media is art, and often what comes as part of being considered art is critique and analysis. You can't consider video games, for example, art without also accepting that they can be political. unethical, or that people might interpret them in ways you don't like. Art is by its very nature interpretive and subjective, and the lenses we use to analyze art are, likewise, highly varied and often even contradictory. Appreciating and loving an art form by critiquing and deconstructing it is fine, commendable even, but if you're going to do so, you also have to accept that your love and your interpretation of works of art are not universal nor correct, because there is no such thing as a correct interpretation of a work of art.
Sonic the Hedgehog has come to theaters this weekend, and we are seeing some really weird tactics being deployed by the SJWs to do whatever they can to tear down this movie, because they're so butthurt over the fact that Birds of Prey did not do well in its opening weekend, and they are terrified of Sonic the Hedgehog. That's right, they are terrified of this movie because they think that Sonic the Hedgehog is going to hurt Birds of Prey's box office even more.
Hello everyone, thought I'd just make another one of these after the last few videos were just fucking depressing as fuck. I do like making the serious, important videos like that, but it is sometimes quite a bummer, so I thought I'd put out one that's a bit more fun and a bit more media focused. I hope you enjoyed it. I've decided that I'm going to make the next one of these on representation in media, because honestly, this is probably the thing that chuds just don't understand the most, so look out for that, I guess. Anyway, as I'm sure you're aware, the names currently on screen right now are the names of people who give me money each month on Patreon. If you want to join them, there will be a link in the description, and if you donate more than $5, then you do get extra bonuses, like you do get videos a couple of days early, and I'll read your name and or username out at the end of each video. So today I especially want to thank Alice Jade, Calliope, Chris Ragnacci, Emily, Ebri Jeffstein, Nanza Kambe. Next we have Ryan, Brian, Pixels Green, Stacey Solano, Susie M, Theodore Pekelarov, Thomas McCallum, Tom Newport, and Wickerbitch. You can also follow me on Twitter if you want, ask me a question on Curious Cat, or you can even join the Discord. There will, again, be links in the description to everything that I've just mentioned. Hope you're having a good one, and I'll see you next time. Bye!